Israel vows to shut down Al Jazeera, accusing the network of incitement in its coverage of the recent protests around the al-Aqsa Mosque compound. We'll examine the reasons behind this decision. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine. Now, the government of Israel has moved to block Al Jazeera's journalists from reporting inside the country. An official request has been made to withdraw the network's accreditation. It echoes one of the main demands made by the 4 Arab countries that are blockading Qatar. Now, the Ministry of Communications held a news conference earlier on Sunday. Here's some of what was said.
First of all, we turned to the government press office to revoke the press cards of the Al Jazeera network, and we spoke to the Minister of Defense to close Al Jazeera's offices. This is not up to me, and it's not under my authority. Alongside this, I will go through the legislatory mechanism to create authority under which I can act freely. I believe this legislation will be in the coming Knesset session. We will try to end it as quickly as possible.
All right, let's introduce our guests now. Joining us from Beirut is Rami Khouri, Senior Fellow and Professor of Journalism at the American University of Beirut. In Tel Aviv, we have Gideon Levy, columnist at Haaretz newspaper. And in London, we have Aidan, Director of the Ethical Journalism Network. Welcome to you all. Can I start with you, Gideon? You're in Israel. What is your response then to this action that seems to be underway now against the Al Jazeera media network?
I'm deeply ashamed. I'm ashamed as an Israeli. I'm ashamed as a journalist. I'm ashamed as a viewer of Al Jazeera and a contributor to Al Jazeera. I'm ashamed even as a human being. One should see it as not as a step which stands by itself, but one should see the context. And the context is that Israel is going in a very, very dangerous path of shutting mouths, of shutting any criticism from within Israel and from the outside.
I was going to, Gideon,
supporter is immediately...
I was actually going to ask you about the space in which you operate as a journalist in Israel. I know that there are other complaints, particularly by the Foreign Correspondents Association in Israel. They're complaining about the treatment that they've received from the police, particularly concerning the coverage of the al-Aqsa Mosque compound.
Yeah, I wasn't there. Some of my colleagues were complaining, especially the reporter of Haaretz. He was stopped by the police. He was pushed away from the arena. But as I tried to say before, one should see the context. It's much of a broader context in which Israel is fighting any alternative voice, any criticism. Any criticism will be shut down in this country from the outside and from the inside. And this is very worrying. And you know what? It should worry, above all, the Israelis, even before Al Jazeera people.
And Aidan, coming to you in London, conventional wisdom is that if the authorities move against you as a media organisation, as a newspaper, a radio station or a television news channel, it means you're doing something right. Would you agree?
Well, I'm not sure if that's right, but I think what this means is, I think we have to look at the nature of the action that Israel is taking. It is actually quite unprecedented. Israel, for many, many years, has had one very clear attitude towards critical journalism, particularly from Palestinian journalists, and that is to suppress it wherever possible. Palestinian journalists have been denied freedom of movement. There have been attacks on Palestinian media, actually even some military attacks. Some journalists have been killed. What's different about this, and this is very important and I think very worrying, is that it's an attack on the international media. And I think the Foreign Correspondents Association will be extremely worried by this decision that's being taken by the Israeli government to target Al Jazeera, because they will be asking the question, well, if Al Jazeera are attacked today, who is attacked tomorrow?
Aidan?
Is Israel going to Yes.
Aidan, the government is saying that Al Jazeera's coverage and its reporters on the ground they're being accused of incitement. Incitement to what? I'm not entirely sure, but that's the word that they're using, saying that Al Jazeera correspondents are guilty of incitement.
But that's not a justification for closing them down and denying accreditation. I mean, there are lots of media where we might disagree with what the journalists are saying and so on. We might say that it should be reported in a different way, and there are ways of dealing with media that we don't agree with, and we should have dialogue. We should try to work out what the problems are. But what we're looking at here is something quite distinct. This is a full frontal attack on the right of Al Jazeera and its journalists to operate freely in Israel, and I suspect also the occupied territories. And what that means, it's a direct act of censorship. And I think other journalists, other international journalists, trying to cover under very difficult conditions the situation, around the Temple Mount, around the occupied territories, are going to be asking themselves, well, what are we going to be allowed to do now? Is Israel going to attack us, to deny us accreditation if we put out critical reports and so on? So I think foreign journalists and I think international media organizations should be deeply concerned. They need to defend Al Jazeera from this attack, because it's not just an attack on Al Jazeera and its journalists. In fact, it's an attack on any journalist working in Israel who might want to be reporting information which is very critical of the government and which the government would not like to have circulated. And that's extremely worrying. And most of all, it's worrying because it undermines, as always, Israel's claim to be the only democracy within the region. Well, you cannot claim to be the only democracy within the region if you make a full frontal attack, as we're seeing here, on one of the prime institutions of democracy, which is press freedom and the free press.
Okay. Rami, this action taken against Al Jazeera puts Israel firmly in the camp of the four blockading Arab nations of Qatar, namely Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE and Egypt. Is this by design?
Well, I think it clarifies what's going on broadly in the region and even outside the region, where you have rather autocratic, top-heavy regimes, some of which, like Israel, have democratic institutions which are primarily democratic for the Jewish Israelis, but when it comes to Arab Palestinian Israelis, they're not so democratic. But you see all over the region countries doing two things, and I've watched this for 50 years now. I've been working as a journalist in the Arab world for 50 years, and I've seen two main trends, and we see them happening now in Arab countries, in Israel and Turkey and other places. Any government that doesn't like the reporting and people exploring what these governments are doing will blame the media, will say that this is incitement and terrorism and it's against security, and they will blame foreigners. So the foreigners and the media are the two great culprits. It's not surprising that Trump is saying similar things about foreigners and the media in the United States, or Erdogan in Turkey, or Sisi in Egypt. This is a common trend among sort of tyrants, maybe we should call them, or autocrats, and it doesn't work. The irony is it just doesn't work. The point of Jazeera being the biggest, most popular television service in the Arab world is that there was a thirst for this kind of honest, pluralistic, contentious debate reporting all over the Arab world. Ordinary people wanted it, and that's why it got to be the biggest news service in the Arab world. So trying to shut it down, as many Arab countries have done, doesn't work. It increases the demand among Arab citizens and Israelis and Turks and others for more honest reporting. We saw in the United States what happened when Trump clamped down on the media. There's been an explosion in good reporting and subscriptions to quality newspapers. So it's counterproductive. So it shows that not only are these governments autocratic, but they're also a little bit imbecilic in terms of their thinking that by doing this, they can actually help themselves. They actually hurt themselves.
And Gideon, this has been a bit of a campaign, hasn't it, from the Israeli government against Al Jazeera, and it's been building up for a little while. But earlier, maybe 10 days ago, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu on his Facebook page posted that he wanted to shut down Al Jazeera, but that he cited legal obstacles that were preventing him from doing so immediately, and that he would enact those laws which would enable him to take this action. But it seems as though they're doing that anyway. What is the legal environment? Is it breaking its own rules?
By the end of the day, I'm sure that he will find excuses, and unfortunately, I'm afraid that the Supreme Court will surrender. If it will get to the Supreme Court, the only way to stop it is to appeal to the Supreme Court. But I'm afraid that when he will come with his professional reports of the security system, which claims that the incitement of Al Jazeera is endangering the security of Israel, which they will easily find, then even the Supreme Court will not stop him. But by the end of the day, it's not a legal question. It is a moral question. It is about the nature of Israel. It's about the nature of its regime. It's about freedom of speech. And it's not only about the foreign journalists or Al Jazeera. It is about all of us, including Israeli journalists. They start there. And if it depends on Mr. Netanyahu, he would shut up Haaretz, my newspaper. He would love to see Haaretz becoming illegal in Israel, and wait and see.
And Gideon, staying with you, because Mr. Netanyahu and indeed the rest of the government have said that this is not a freedom of speech issue. This is a matter of national security. And I'm just wondering whether you think that flies, whether you think there's any kind of justification for this.
As you most probably know, security is the informal religion of Israel, and on behalf of security you can almost do anything in Israel, from killing to expelling to closing down an international leading network. On behalf of security, everything becomes legal, and this shows really the character of Israel. I don't think that anyone will take it seriously, for sure not real Democrats, neither in Israel or abroad, will take it seriously that any kind of network has anything to do with security. Journalists have nothing to do with security. Journalists cannot endanger security. Journalists are also not supposed to work for security. Journalists are about to report and to criticize and to share their views. And this is what Al Jazeera does, if Mr. Netanyahu likes it or not. And this is what Haaretz is doing, if Mr. Netanyahu likes it or not. But you know, in those days when he owns almost a newspaper of himself, being donated by an American billionaire who made his money in Las Vegas, he thinks that this newspaper is free speech, because this newspaper does only one thing, and this is praising the leader.
Indeed. Aidan, coming back to you, often journalists, when they are uncovering uncomfortable truths, are accused of being partisan, of being activists. Explain for us the difference, if you like, between perhaps a campaigning journalist and an activist, and the fine line between the two.
Well, I mean, it's actually pretty straightforward. The ethics of journalism demand that journalists not only that they tell the truth, that is, that they are accurate and fact-based in their reporting, and that they're independent and they don't act as propagandists, but they have an obligation to be, as far as possible, impartial. So one of the things a journalist will have to do when they're telling a story, no matter where they're telling that story, is to look for all sides. They want to make sure that all voices are heard. So a journalist is someone who is going to look for one point of view and then have a look, is there another contrary, relevant, point of view that needs to be heard in order to make the story hold, so that the audience can fully understand all points of view. An activist or a propagandist is someone who's only interested in one point of view, and that distinguishes them from journalists. They are propagandists. They are people who have one ideological view, one political view to support, one angle that they want to take, and they do not look for other sides of the story. It's the distinguishing feature between journalism and propaganda, and journalism and activism. And all journalists, good journalists, and those who are trained, who work in the international media community, in Al Jazeera and elsewhere, know very well that in order to do your job properly, you've got to look for contrary points of view. You've got to make sure that all sides of the story are told. And when you do that, it is inevitable that you are going to find yourself in the crosshairs of conflict with governments or with others who would like not to hear from their opponents. They would not like to hear contrary voices. So consequently, by the very nature of our work, journalists are going to be in conflict with people who would like to suppress the voices of others, the ones that they don't want to hear. And that's what we're seeing now in Israel. So good journalists have got to try to make sure that all voices are included. Activists are only interested in one line, one objective, one ideology, and it's really, really quite distinct. The problem here, and I think it's very clear, is that the Israeli government is using the mantra of national security, just saying the words, we have to protect national security, just using words which are pejorative like incitement, is a way of building up hostility against journalism and against media. But they do so without producing convincing evidence at all that there is an attack here or that there is propaganda at work.
All right, okay.
And so that's why we shouldn't accept that formulation at all.
Okay, coming to you, Rami, in Beirut, the irony is, I guess, that Al Jazeera is one of the few channels, one of the few outlets in the region that has allowed an Israeli voice, Israeli government voice, to be heard on a regular basis. And so, as you were pointing out earlier, in many ways, this is not in Israel's own self-interest, is it?
Right. It's one of the many ironies in this situation that Jazeera was really the first Arab television service to provide a comprehensive view of the entire region, including Iran and Israel and Turkey and all the Arab countries, and to give the many voices in these societies an opportunity to be heard. The other irony is that when Jazeera started, when the Arabic Jazeera started in the mid-90s, a few years after that, I remember very distinctly how everybody in the region tried to copy it. So the Jordanians, the Egyptians, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, the Saudis with Arabiya, everybody tried to create their own satellite pan-Arab station that was relatively open and comprehensive in its coverage with a variety of viewpoints, but nobody got anywhere close to what Jazeera was able to do. And then the Americans and the French and the Russians, they all jumped in to create their own Arabic language pan-Arab television services, and all of them flopped because none of them had the fundamental critical element that made Jazeera so successful, which is to link with the basic human dignity and decency and desire for knowledge of ordinary men and women sitting in their homes and offices and shops and the 400 million Arabs that exist all over the Arab world. Nobody could do what Jazeera did, which is treat the Arab citizens decently and with respect as human beings who deserve to know the truth and to hear different viewpoints. And that's why it has become so successful. But to add to Aidan's point that it's the wider context, and Gideon's as well, the wider context has to be understood. Arab countries like the Emirates, the Saudis, Bahrain, Egypt, and others have been jailing citizens for tweeting. And what do they accuse them of doing? They accuse them of disturbing national calm or threatening national security, these vague words that the Israelis now use and others use in the region without defining them. And of course, the courts do whatever the executive wants them to do. So we have a real problem all across the region in the shrinking space for ordinary citizens to express themselves. And no surprise, therefore, that among the highest penetration of social media use, Twitter and Facebook in the entire world as a percentage of population are countries like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, because they don't have the opportunity otherwise in their society to be treated like decent human beings and to hear the truth and to express themselves. So there's a battle going on here, and this battle is being waged not just at the level of governments and security agencies shutting down services, but is being waged at the battle of ordinary men and women sitting in their homes with their cell phones and looking at the news that they want to hear and expressing themselves as they would like to do so. And this battle is going to be won by the decency and dignity of ordinary human beings who will triumph in the end.
Gideon, does it strike you as odd in any way that the Israeli government is aligning itself on this issue of the Al Jazeera media network with the likes of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Bahrain and United Arab Emirates?
Those are the potential allies of Israel. This does not surprise me at all. It does surprise me that they went so far. I thought they will wait a bit because they have no reason to do it, and they are stupid enough to do it without understanding what kind of consequences it will have in the Arab world, in the international media, and so forth. Israel is considered to look for ways to the heart of those four countries who are defined in Israel as the moderates, part of them with quite corrupted regimes. Those are Israeli potential allies or allies under the table, but I wouldn't connect it to this. I think that this step has much more to do with Israel's strategy to shut down any criticism against Israel and to accuse any criticism on Israel as either anti-Semite or harming the security of Israel. I wouldn't think that it has to do with the regional context. It has much more to do with the way of thinking of Israel, that it has the right to shut up any criticism.
And is this a consequence, Gideon, staying with you, it's a very interesting point, is this a consequence of Mr. Netanyahu feeling the pressure of being in a very right-wing coalition and with regard to the al-Aqsa Mosque issue being seen to have being forced into perhaps an embarrassing about turn, a volte-face?
No, he wasn't forced to do so. He's still powerful enough, even though he's going now into a very, very complicated period, but that's another issue. The interrogation and the accusation against him, he's going to have some other worries in the coming days and weeks, but it has nothing to do. It is his way of thinking. It didn't start with Al Jazeera, and it will not end up with Al Jazeera. They are chasing NGOs, human rights activists, NGOs, liberals in Israel and abroad. They are fighting BDS as if BDS is the new demon who is going to destroy Israel. They are doing it systematically for a few years now, and Al Jazeera is just part of it, and it will go on after Al Jazeera. I wonder who will be next. They would love to see BBC out of Israel, even though BBC became quite pro-Israeli, I must say. But by the end of the day, the way of thinking is that the way of Israel to introduce itself as the right side, as the just side, is by shutting up voices which oppose to this way of thinking.
And very briefly, if you would, Aidan, so it sounds very much as though you're all in agreement and that effectively by taking this action, Israel is most definitely losing the moral high ground and losing its claim, if you like, to being the only democratic system within the Middle East.
I think that's right. And I think really now it's incumbent upon the defenders of democracy around the world really to speak up, to stand up for press freedom, for the rights of journalists and so on. So, I hope very much we're going to see from the institutions of the United Nations, from within the European Union, from the democratic institutions that really have made the issue of press freedom, the right of people to speak freely without being subject to censorship, that we will hear from them, a clear and distinct condemnation of what's going on. I think this should not be allowed to pass, and it should not be allowed to stand. Israel, I think, should be subject to strong diplomatic pressure. There should be strong protests as well, and I'm sure there will be from the press freedom community, and I think from institutions, civil society institutions also inside Israel and within the region, to really highlight what a threat to democracy this is.
Thank you very much indeed. Aidan White, Gideon Levy and Rami Khouri, thank you all. And as ever, thank you for watching the programme. You can see it again anytime you like by going to the website, aljazeera.com. If you want more discussion, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, and you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'm @Martine Dennis. From the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.